Hi, Jordan.
Hi, hello.
I'll just wait a couple of minutes to see if anyone else joins us.
Yeah, otherwise it looks it's only two of us.
Yeah, sure. I guess it'll be recorded, so at least it may be useful in the future in any case, but
Yes.
yeah, we'll just wait one more minute. Hey, I think I'll begin. So hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. My name is Cameron, and I am from TNG. And so the idea is that as part of the knowledge handover, I'll just give an overview of Magma's documentation. So broadly, I want to cover, just give an overview of what documentation there is, then talk about how one can contribute to it, how one has to deal with it when there's a release, and then also a bit about the CI/CD side of things. And hopefully we'll have some time at the end for questions, but please feel free to stop me if anything's unclear or if you have any questions. So I'm very happy for it to be interactive. Okay, so I'll just share my screen now. Okay, can you see that now? Please say if
Yes.
not. Okay, thanks. Yeah, so
Yes, yes.
broadly, Magma has, so yeah, overview now. So broadly, Magma has two places for documentation. So there's the so-called Dockersaurus, which you can see here with this GitHub URL. And then also in the, if you go to Magma organization and the Magma repo, you can find this wiki here within GitHub. And as far as I understand, the sort of broad distinction, or why we have two, is that what you find in the Dockersaurus is more version dependent. So things that will change between different releases, whereas what you find in the wiki is less version dependent. So sort of more general things that maybe are sort of more geared towards contribution. Yeah, so sort of in broad terms, I would say that the Dockersaurus is more for users, people who want to deploy Magma, and the wiki is more for contributors, but it's not a totally clear distinction. I would point out that I'll talk more about it later, but the code, so the files that form this Dockersaurus are checked in. So if you go to the code and you go to the docs folder, you will see all the files that make this up. Whereas, and as a result, if you want to make changes to this, then you need to make a pull request and people need to review it. Whereas within the wiki, this isn't the case. And if you're a member of the organization, then you're able to make changes to this without needing approval from people. In terms of documentation for these sort of documentation methods, the Dockersaurus, so this is made using an open source tool from Meta called Dockersaurus. So of course, there's upstream documentation if you want to read more about it. So you can find that here. And then the GitHub docs also have some documentation about the wikis. So how you can interact with them, add pages, look at history, etc. So I'd point you to those if you want in-depth information about them in general terms. But here, the idea is that I haven't got time to go through anything in great detail in terms of like the actual content of the websites, but it's more about, as a maintainer, how you would interact with them. So at this stage, are there any questions about this? Okay, because if not, then I will talk a bit about contributing to the docs. So first up, I would point you to this page. So this is in the wiki, and you can navigate to it from here. This is the contributing documentation page. And so a lot of what I will talk about is also covered here if you want to read more about it. But before one looks at contributing documentation, I would just point you to this styling and writing convention section. So I think it's good to have a look at this if you want to make some changes, or also if you just want to review some changes. And without going into going through each point, it's sort of about using clear and simple language where possible, being descriptive where possible, about sort of capitalizing the orchestrator, the NMS, the different components of Magma consistently, so that everything's nice and tidy, and using clear, concise titles, that sort of thing. So I think nothing too unexpected. So at this point, I'll now just have a look at how one would contribute to the wiki, because this is a bit simpler than the Dockersaurus. So as I said before, if you want to edit it, I believe you have to be a member of the organization. And also it has no baked-in review process. So if I want to make some edit to some page, so say this page, then I can go click on edit. I can make some change, whatever. And then I can preview it here. And if I'm happy with it, then I can optionally add a message, like a commit message, and save the page, and then it'll automatically be reflected. But I don't want to do that in this case. Yeah, and another feature of this, while it doesn't have a while it doesn't have a review process, you can see what changes have been made in the past. So here we see all the changes that have been made throughout history, this page, and you're able to compare revisions if you wanted to go back and see what's been done. So this is just the last change made to the homepage, for example. Now, I would suggest that despite there not being a baked-in review procedure, if you do want to make a big change to this documentation, it can be good to have someone look at your changes. So just as an example, I'll point you to an issue from the past. So this is one I opened about documenting the Artifactory. And here, Niels wrote some documentation in the issue. And then if we go down, we see that Lars reviewed it and said that it looked good. And then it was published to the wiki page. I think for small changes, fixing typos, etc., it isn't necessary to get people to check your work necessarily. But if you're making a big change and adding a whole new page, it can be a good idea. And similarly, if you want to add a new page, there's a similar procedure where you can click here and preview what you want to write, and then also add a message, etc. Are there any questions about the GitHub wiki for Magma? Okay, yeah, and please stop me if anything is unclear, because I'm sort of trying to cover quite a lot of ground. Okay, so now I will go on to the Dockersaurus. So that's this page here. And as I said, while the GitHub wiki isn't versioned, this is. So here we see that we have this next at the top, which indicates that this is the sort of most up-to-date version of the docs. So it doesn't correspond to a version yet, but I think the idea is that it's in development and it will correspond to the next version, so 1.9, I assume. And if I click on next, then we see we have lots of different versions of the Magma documentation. So I can click here. I see 1.8 at the top, and then this is the version of the docs that corresponds to the latest release of Magma, which is 1.8. At this point, I will just go into the code and have a look at this structure that we have that produces this. Can people see my screen okay? In the CVS code?
Yes.
Okay, great. So here we have the docs folder in Magma. I just have the master branch checked out. And to begin with, we have a makefile, we have a README. But in terms of these folders, we have, first of all, this READMEs folder. So this essentially contains the markdown files that you can see on the latest version of the documentation. So these markdown files that produce this, you can find in the READMEs. In the Dockersaurus folder, you can find versioned documentation, so the markdown files that correspond to previous versions, and also you find configuration files, so files that define what the sidebar is, and also what the theme of the website is, etc. And then in the third folder, PDFs, and this just contains some sort of Magma technical specification documentation. So that isn't so relevant for what I'm talking about. If we dig a little deeper and just look at the most up-to-date documentation files, we see we sort of have a rough split by components or by sort of basics contributing. So the different files are split, I think, in a very sensible way. And if we click in, say here, basics, then we see the different markdown files that define the documentation. Each one has a header, so it has this ID, and the guidelines say this ID should be the same, ideally, as the file name. We have a title, although I think mostly the configuration that's done is that we have a high title set to true, which means that this actually doesn't produce a title, but rather you then define the title in the markdown sort of file itself. Then how do we actually go from these markdown files to sort of having this the sidebar we see? So if we go into the Dockersaurus, we have a sidebars.json file. And here we see, if I just put these into Windows, that this mirrors, this defines the sidebar we see here. So we have the getting started, and then we have these 4 pages, we have the usage and then the how-to, and that corresponds to here. We also have a site config.js, and this defines sort of general look and feel of this site, so the themes that are used, etc. I think these are the most important files in terms of the ones that you would interact with most regularly if you're maintaining documentation. Are there any questions about any of this? Okay, then I will go on to talk a bit about how you can actually make some changes to this. So as a starter, a useful thing to do is that if I make some changes, I want to test them and see that they do what I expect. And if I just run make dev in the Magma docs folder, then, and wait a moment, it will start a Docker container, and it will start a local version of the website. So here I see localhost, and if I do docker ps, I see that I have this container running. And so this is useful if I want to make some changes and then just see how it looks before I commit it. So now I'll go through a couple of different scenarios in terms of how you actually update edit the documentation. So first of all, just how you would edit a file. Second, how you add a new file. And then third of all, I will talk about how you interact with previous versions. So if you want to change versions from the past, essentially. So let's begin with the first scenario, which is just I want to make a change to a file that already exists. So say I want to edit this file here. So if I look in this sidebar's JSON file, which I told you about earlier, I see that okay, it's the first page, it's this introduction page, and it's in this basics folder. So if I just navigate to readmes for the latest version, I go to basics and I go to introduction.md. I see indeed I have this introduction ID, and I can show you that, okay, I want to make a change. I write something here, save it, and then immediately it's reflected here. So I can see that my change is doing what I expect. And say that I'm now happy with my change. What can I do? Well, one thing that's useful to do, a different make command I can run is make pre-commit. And this just runs a markdown linter. And so it checks that it's okay in terms of this linting. So you can see the command that's sort of run under the hood here. And it tells me it's passed, so it's happy with the linting. This is checked in the CI. So if you make a pull request and then and you haven't satisfied the linter, then you would get a red cross. Let's just check that I can get it to fail. So let's just add a space here and rerun it. And now it tells me that introduction.md line 6, indeed here I have multiple spaces after hash on ATX style heading. Okay, in this situation, we know how we've broken it, but a nice feature is that there's also another command we can run, make pre-commit fix, and this will automatically fix it for me. I don't know if it works in all cases, but essentially it's just running the markdown linter with a fix flag. And so this can be nice if you have caused some markdown lint problems, and this can often fix them for you. So now I've made my change and I'm happy with it. The linter is happy. So now I could commit it, and I could push that and open a pull request. Are there any questions about any of this so far? Okay, great. So then I will move on to creating a new file. So let me just get rid of these changes. Okay, so say I want to add a new file to getting started. I don't know, it doesn't matter what, but say I've got a new feature, I want to add something to the documentation. How would I go about doing this? Okay, so what I can do is go to the readmes. I could go to this folder structure, and okay, say I think that it fits the basics folder best. I can then create a new file. I don't know what it will be called, but let's say new feature.md for the moment. what do I want to do? So I want to first of all copy the header that must be present in each file. And I want to give it an ID that's consistent with the file name and give it a title. I then want to, because hide title is set to true, I want to add a title to my new page. So add my new feature. And then I'll just add some text. Okay, now I've created a file, but it won't yet be reflected in the website because I haven't added it to the sidebars. So at that point, I need to go to the sidebars again, and I want to add it to the getting started, say. Then, okay, I want to point to it, so I added it to basics, and I gave it the ID new feature, I think. Now in this case, I have modified the sidebar, so actually a live reload won't work. So I need to just restart the container. I can just run make dev. And here we see that my new feature page is here. But as I expected, it's got the corresponding title and it's got the text that I wrote. So again, at this point, I can run make pre-commit, check that it looks good. And actually, it isn't happy because I need to add a new line. So I can run make pre-commit fix. It adds a new line for me. Now the linter is happy. And so at this point, I'm able to commit my changes and open a pull request. But one point to note is that if I look at the files that I've changed by looking at my sort of version control window, so I see, first of all, I have my new file I added as expected. I also have made changes to this sidebars.json by adding a new line. And then there's a third change here. So this is this en.json. And so let me just open this and have a look at it. So it says here, this file is auto-generated by write-translations.js. And indeed, by running make, I have generated an update to this file. If I look at the diff, I see that basically, because I've added a new file, it's correspondingly been added to this automatically generated file. And if I want to create a pull request, then I need to upload all 3 files. And if I don't upload this file, then there will be a check that will fail in the CI. But I will discuss that in more detail a bit later. So this covers how to add a new file. Any questions at this stage? Okay, so then I will go on to how to modify previous versions of the docs. So say I'm looking at version 1.8 and I notice something that's wrong, say I'm following some instructions and some command doesn't work, and I want to apply a fix. How do I go about doing that? Okay, so far I've only looked at how I work, modify or play around with the latest version of the docs. So the first thing to point out is that, as I sort of alluded to, in the docs folder, we have the readmes folder with the current up-to-date versions of the markdown files. And we have also a Dockersaurus folder, which contains things like version docs and version sidebars. So on master, we have versioned documentation. This means that sort of the 1.8 version of the docs I see when I go to the Dockersaurus doesn't correspond to like the docs that exist on the 1.8 branch, but rather they correspond to the files that are generated here in the master version. This means that if I want to make a change to the previous version, I haven't got to backport them to a branch, but rather I can update them simply in master. So let me just show you how this works. So say I want to update version 1.7, the introduction page. What would I do? So I can go to version 1.7. I can go to the basics and to the introduction.md. and we see we have a sort of similar looking file to what we looked at before, though there is an original ID in the header, and there's also an ID which contains some sort of versioning information at the start. Let me just try and write something here, and I'll just create a testing environment, and then we'll see if well, let me get rid of this first, and then we'll see. Okay, so we go to 1.7. Okay, and then I'll make my change. And indeed, we see a change here. So, but we don't see the change, hopefully, if we go to master. Yeah, so we've only interacted with this version as we wanted. So by doing this, I'm able to edit previous versions of the docs. But actually, there is something to be careful about. And in particular, if I go to version 1.8 of the docs and look in basics, I see there is no introduction .md file. This might seem a bit strange. So let me write hello again, and then go to version 1.8. And here we see that the hello is also written here. And that's because it's using the file from version 1.7. Now, as I understand it, the reason is that if a file isn't changed between versions, then the file isn't copied into the the new versions tree. So, to sort of say this again, maybe more simply, introduction.md wasn't changed between version 1.7 and 1.8. So a new file wasn't created, it wasn't copied across. Instead, it just uses the version from 1.7. I don't know why this is. I guess maybe it's to save space. But it means that if you want to update only 1.7 or only 1.8 in this case, then you need to be a bit careful. And so what I would do in this situation, let me just get rid of my changes, is I would go to the Dockersaurus, I'd go to the version docs, where we have 1.7, 1.8, and I would manually copy across the file I'm interested in modifying. And if I then open this file, so now I have this new 1.8, I see that I need to update the ID because this is now wrong. But if I now make, again, I might need to regenerate this. Let me just do this, sorry. Oh, sorry. Yeah, so if I regenerate this, and then go to 1.7, okay, let me just add hello. Oh. I see that it's here in 1.7, but now if I go to 1.8, I don't see it anymore. So if you are updating previous versions of the documentation, then you need to be careful because you might change versions that you didn't intend on changing. And I would just point you to the fact that there is a note about this in the docs. So there's this warning here about modifying the documentation, and this is essentially saying what I've just said. So one should be careful when modifying previous versions. And a sort of more general comment about versioning is that when one makes a change to the documentation, one should consider which version to change. So if you're just adding a new feature that will come out in 1.9, then only add it to the master version, so to the the readmes. So you wouldn't edit the Dockersaurus in the versions. You just recommend edit readmes. But then if you find an error in 1.8 and it's also in the master version, then you would want to modify both 1.8 and also next. So both in Dockersaurus and also in the readmes. Does that make sense? Are there any questions to that? I hope I've explained it okay. Okay, so that concludes the sort of different scenarios I wanted to talk through. So first of all, just editing a file, adding a file, and then also editing the version documentation. The next section I wanted to talk about is about releases. So what do I do when version 1.9, say, of Magma comes out? Let's discard these files. How do I create a new version of Magma documentation for 1.9? Niels did a show and tell on releases. I mentioned the documentation, but I will go into a little bit more detail. And the first thing I will point you to is that if you go to this contributing documentation page and go to this section, versioning documentation, you'll find instructions about how to do it. So the idea is that you're creating a new snapshot of the documentation, and it doesn't take very long at all. So you basically just run through these steps, and the documentation will be created. So I can just run through them now very quickly. It shouldn't take long at all. So we change the Dockersaurus, and then we want to just close any containers we have running. And then we want to do a build here. Okay, that's done. And then we want to start the container. Okay, again, done. And there's actually a little mistake here. This dash shouldn't be here. Then we can go into the container. So we can see we're in there now. And we can do the yarn install and the yarn build, which just takes a little bit of time. And then finally, we can create a new version with this command, which I can do in a few seconds. One point to make, with just like a warning to be careful, is that, so I think typically before you cut the documentation and create a new version, it's good to wait until the new version is finalized, so that in case there are any last minute changes to the docs, or some new features or need to be documented or whatever. I think it's often new docs are often cut when the new version's branch has been finalized. And of course, one should be careful that if new changes have been made to docs that aren't for that version, they've been made in the meantime while the new branch was tested, the branch of the new version, then you don't want to include those necessarily in the new documentation. So care should just be made not to include incorrect things in the new version documentation. So here we see that it's finished, and then I can finally run this with 1.9.0, and like that, it is done. And so if we look in the changes, we see that these files have been added to this version 1.9.0 folder. We have, these are just markdown files that have been copied across. We then have an update to this versions.json file, and we have a new version 1.9 sidebar. So this is a snapshot of a sidebar for this particular version. So now if we exit the container and run make dev another time, we should get a version of the documentation that contains our new version. So we can just verify that. And so if we now go to next, we see indeed we have a new current version, 1.9, with 1.8 now moved to a past version. And so indeed we can click here and check that everything looks good. Just, it's worth having a I click through, and then we see that we've got some updates to the en.json to reflect the new version. And so one could now commit all these and create a pull request, and yeah, once merged, have a new version of the docs. And so, and if you want to have a reference, then of course you can go to look through old pull request, and here you see an example of the update to the docs that was done for version 1.8. So are there any questions about doing releases? Okay, great. So then the final topic I wanted to cover is about CI/CD. And for this, I will go to this GitHub folder, which is where we have our GitHub action workflows. If I click into here, I can find two different workflows that are documentation related. So first of all, we have this docs workflow, .yaml, and the name is docs lint and check generated files in sync. So this you'll find will run on your pull requests if you open one and modify documentation. What does it do? So first of all, it runs make pre-commit. So if you've forgotten to run this check or chose not to, and there's a problem with linting, then this will turn red. There's also a markdown in sync check. What this does is checks that the generated files are in sync. So that, for example, if you've made some changes to the sidebars or whatever, added a new file, and you haven't committed the en.json file, then this will turn red because it's out of sync. And then this is actually a new check that's been added this week, I believe. And this checks that whether there are broken symlinks in the documentation folder. And then we have another workflow, so Dockersaurus workflow, and the name, docs build and deploy. So it essentially does what you would expect. It runs on pushes, so on commits to the master branch. So if you make a pull request to changing documentation and then it gets merged, this will automatically run and update the Dockersaurus website. So it just manipulates the directory structure to what Dockersaurus expects, and then deploys it using GitHub pages. And so, yeah, this is the workflow that ensures that this is up to date when it's modified, basically. So that's it for the CI/CD and the documentation workflows. And that's also what I had planned for my run through of the documentation. So at this point, I would ask whether there are any questions from anyone about any of this. Okay. Of course, if you think of questions, feel free to message me in Slack, and I'd be happy to answer them. But if there's nothing at this present time, then I guess perhaps we can close the meeting.
Thank you very much. I mean, it was quite brief, but quite informative. I mean, we didn't have enough people to generate lots of questions, and you know, most of us seems that we are very familiar with this, so we have nothing to ask.
Sure.
But thank you very much for the show and tell.
You're welcome. You're very welcome. Okay. Yeah, then I guess we can take a break before the DevOps meeting. So yeah, thank you very much for attending. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.